Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa, Secretary, Ministry of Defense and Urban Development, Chief of the Defense Staff, Commanders of the Army, the Navy and the Air Force, the Vice Chancellor, my fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Before I start, I must thank the Vice Chancellor for inviting me to be a part of this August gathering. I'm deeply honored to be here today in the renowned Sir John Kotelawala Defense University to share my thoughts on some issues pertaining to ensuring national security through reconciliation and sustainable development. While my talk will be generic and based on my experiences in India, I will try to enmesh my thoughts in the context of the Indo-Sri Lankan relationship. Needless to say, I speak for myself and my views are personal. They do not reflect in any manner the views of the Government of India or the military establishment in India. But before I start, I think I must take this opportunity to commend the political and military leadership of Sri Lanka, as well as the armed forces of Sri Lanka, on their victory over the forces of terror. Very few nations have achieved what the government of Sri Lanka and the armed forces of Sri Lanka have done. And I say this with the full conviction after having served 2 years in the jungles of Trincomalee, that is on the Trincomalee-Vavonia sector, and I know the magnitude and the difficulty of the task, which very few people thought could not be accomplished, but yet was done through political will and military determination. Now, any discussion on ensuring national security must first define or expand upon what we mean or understand by this term. What is national security? National security is and always will be a prime concern of the inhabitants of a state and its leadership. But it is open to different contextual interpretations. Some people may look upon it as an existential issue. Some may look upon the issue as one concerning a nation's desire and capacity for self-defense. Some others may perceive national security in terms of the power of a nation to maintain the government's sovereignty within its territorial boundaries. All these constructs are valid, and they are very relevant too. But they do not encompass national security in its entire context, in its entirety. The focus here, the first step, this focus, what we are seeing, is on external actors as threats to a nation's well-being through foreign militaries. But internal factors also play a very decisive role as far as the health of a nation is concerned. In a larger construct, it must also include overcoming threats to peace in society or even to the avoidance of conflicts and confrontation, and the preservation of the lives of people in the society. It must hence be viewed in terms of achieving reconciliation among the diverse groups which are prevalent in any society. When we look at the military approach to national security, it presages a strong military to deter attacks and threats of attack, as well as providing the means of fighting undeterred attacks. This, however, does not necessarily translate into the maintenance of the traditional functions, which, besides the maintenance of the security and territorial integrity of the nation and the society, also includes the maintenance of domestic and civil order and the provision of humanitarian aid where required. Militaries can be used for largely negative purposes too, involving the oppression, the terrorization, and the repression of the citizens, and for the purpose of suppressing popular involvement in politics and civil liberties, an aspect particularly prevalent under military regimes. Rather than being solutions, the military can compound and perpetuate existing problems, upholding regimes and personal interest rather than national interest. Therefore, When I view this particular problem, I would say, in a very fundamental sense, national security must be viewed as a public good and not the private property of the state or of a particular dominant interest. That is the first part of what I wish to state. Reconciliation. When we speak of reconciliation, it presupposes the existence of conflict, either external aggression or internal upheaval. Now, the question that comes foremost to mind is, why is there conflict? If you're talking of internal conflict, why? There has to be a causative factor. External factors have many causes. They may range from a desire to avenge an earlier defeat, an earlier wrong, or to promote through war a country's economic and other interests. But internal conflict is more often than not associated with the word I would like to use, which the Secretary also spoke about and which the Chair also spoke: justice. And I think any time when you find justice being denied in any form, over a period of time, it will lead to conflict. When we look at Sri Lanka, one of the causative factors for insurgency to have come into Sri Lanka was the issue of language. And I would like to delve specifically on this issue of language, not just in Sri Lanka, but in the Asian context, because it has caused, the issue of language has caused upheaval. It caused upheaval in Sri Lanka, but I'm not going to talk of Sri Lanka. I'm going to talk of both India and Pakistan as to what is this context of language and how did it cause upheaval? And then I would like to give to you my thought process as to where the problem really lies. Let me take Pakistan first. Soon after independence, there was a desire to create amongst a disparate society a nation. And it's a very genuine desire. And one of the means to do that was through language, that there must be a common language. So in the wisdom of the leadership of that time, they chose Urdu as the common language, the language to be used in government across the state of Pakistan. But when you analyze it a little bit deeper, you find that the eastern wing, East Pakistan of that time, was a predominantly Bengali-speaking people. In the western wing itself, you had people who, in the western wing, about 50% of the public spoke Punjabi and Saraiki. We had the Balochi-speaking people. We had the people who spoke Sindhi. And Urdu was spoken by a very small majority, the Muhajirs, the people who migrated from India. And Urdu, nothing wrong with having Urdu. It's a beautiful language. It is the language of the courts in India, in undivided India, for centuries. It is the language of governance. My father was in the army, my grandfather was in the army, and they all did their work in Urdu. Urdu is a language of poets. So it has nothing to do with the language per se. The problem was when you try to put that language through force onto a public. And when this happened, in East Pakistan at that time, riots broke out in the 50s. And the first impact was that the Muslim League, which was the most important and dominant player in East Pakistan, was reduced to irrelevance. And a new party came up, the Awami League. And one of the people who were the leaders as far as those riots was concerned was Mujibur Rahman. And this man shot into prominence. Ultimately, you will find that when we look into these issues, when you look into prime causes, the triggers, these are the small triggers which later on lead to bigger problems. Let us look at India. 1950, the Constitution, 26 January 1950, the Constitution is given to the people in the hallowed halls of Parliament. And this Constitution lays down that Hindi will be the language of India, and for the other states, we will give them 15 years to come up to that standard. And post that, Hindi will be used throughout, but till such time, English will be the link language. Fine. But when we started coming to the 60s and this date started approaching, there was tremendous upheaval in the South. The Madras state at that point of